Good evening. Several weeks ago, I was asked if I can help organize a webinar about vaccines with some of the leaders within the community. As I was looking for presenters, I was looking for people who have knowledge both about vaccines and the most knowledge about our community and COVID-19. Based on that, I asked Dr. Bander, who has been at the forefront of the COVID response at Mount Sinai, to moderate the webinar with Dr. Peter Marks. Dr. Bander has worked 18-hour days over the past year or so to ensure that COVID patients get the best care based on the latest available data. On behalf of all patients, their families, and advocates, I want to thank Dr. Bander, along with Dr. Rich, Dr. Aberg, Dr. Liu, for their efforts in saving as many lives as possible at Mount Sinai in New York City. I want to discuss vaccine hesitancy for a minute. There are many legitimate questions that people have about vaccines, and I hope Dr. Marks will be able to address those. On the other side, there are some rumors that are flat out false and have absolutely no basis of truth. We and many other communities, unfortunately, don't have a lot of trust in institutions. Some of it is founded, some of it is not. To most people, all institutions are thrown in the same basket. So on the federal level, if it's the FDA, the CDC, the NIH, or even state and local municipalities, as for that matter, even just medical institutions, are all in the same baskets. One of the most amazing observations that I had during this pandemic within our community was to see how sometimes competing organizations were working together for the common good. Having different medical referral agencies on the same WhatsApp group or text group for the same patient, seeing, for example, Refuah Health mobile parked in Orange County, Long Island, Queens, Brooklyn, or areas where they don't cover, just to help out other organizations or other healthcare centers. Dr. Marks, as you are well aware, we have access to some of the best physicians and scientists in the world. I'm proud to say that most, if not all, decisions that were made by the leadership within the Orthodox community was done in consultation with them. And we tried to act according to whatever was the best data at the time. As we know, media reports are not always accurate. I'll give an example. At convalescent plasma, before that was approved by the FDA, there was a report at a major newspaper that there were letters written from other federal agencies to the FDA not to approve it. And the only reason why the FDA approved it was because they had some outside pressure. Both of us are well aware that that was absolutely not true. And even though it was annoying to me at the time, but you and Dr. Verdon did your due diligence and you asked for additional data. And as you got the additional data and you had time to analyze them, you went ahead and approved it. I want to thank, I think on behalf of myself and everyone in the whole country, for you, Dr. Verdon, Dr. Woodcock, for all the work all of you have done proactively and to look at the data and go wherever the data took you without any bias. One of the things I want to cover that is one of the anti-vax theories is that somehow Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation are trying to implant microchips, try to control population growth, etc. As both you, Dr. Marks, and Dr. Bander are well aware, I've worked with some of the folks at the Gates Foundation. And I can say that I have pretty direct knowledge that the Gates people don't control the vaccine, don't control the therapeutic development process, and obviously have not been able to, or even have a desire to implant chips or add some sort of components in any of the vaccines or therapeutics to control growth. While I don't necessarily agree with everything that the Gates folks stand for, and maybe some of the messages, I do commend them for trying to get therapeutics and vaccines available to underprivileged communities and poor countries. I do have several topics that I'd like Dr. Marks to cover that I've been asked by people Like, what is the difference between an EUA and a full approval? Is there any safety concern when a person gets multiple vaccines at the same time rather than just one vaccine at a time? Does it make sense that a person right after they get a vaccine should be extra cautious to make sure they don't have any exposure to someone with the virus, etc.? On behalf of the entire community, I'd like to thank both of you, Dr. Bander and Dr. Marks, for everything you have done, to save so many lives in the community and for agreeing to do this webinar. With that, Dr. Bander, I'll just give the mic to you.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you hosting this. I think these events are extremely important for us to actually go over the data, but have real sort of heart-to-heart conversations with people who are making these decisions so that people can actually see what's behind it. And I think what Chaim was alluding to is early on in COVID, Dr. Marks, we went through a lot of what we say flip-flops, from hydroxychloroquine to masks, everything. So there's, why should I believe this data? Why is this different? And, almost every kind of, question or conspiracy theory has something behind it. Sometimes it's completely nothing really there, but there's something there that led to the question. We alluded to it earlier before we talked. We'll talk a little bit about, in pregnancies or fertility. We'll get to that in a minute, but I want to just take a structured through here. I know that, you have some connection to this community. Morty was very excited that you grew up near in Brooklyn. So excited to have you back and talking to your neighbors.
No, thank you very much. It's very, some of my fondest memories as a child are of Coney Island, and all of the wonderful things there. So a nice place in my heart. Thank you.
So tonight, I know we have a lot of topics that we'd all want to cover, from just COVID in general to plasma, but we're going to focus on vaccines. And I think, we really, you've headed up the convalescent plasma program for the federal government in terms of looking at it, and that's a big topic. But you've also, as on the FDA, have overseen the development of vaccines, both the research and the rollout. So I think it would be great to hear from you what's different about the vaccines, the mRNA vaccines and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, that people should know about. The whole process was different. It was a very fast process. So why should we not be concerned?
So vaccine development is not one of the biggest money makers for pharmaceutical companies. So when vaccine makers, when there's not a pandemic, go to develop a vaccine, they generally do what's called de-risking. They go very carefully from one phase of development. There are three phases of development: phase 1, 2, and 3. The first is safety. The second is dose finding. The third is safety and efficacy in large populations. And they do those separately, one at a time, starting and stopping, and there can be months in between those different trials. And it's not until the very end, when they think they really are going to have something that's going to get regulatory approval, that they start to scale up manufacturing, and that can take months. So in the setting of a pandemic, you wouldn't want to do that, because you wouldn't want to have an extra year while the virus is circulating, while instead we're just kind of scratching our heads and waiting for manufacturing scale up. So what was done here is the manufacturers came and talked to FDA. We worked with them to develop what were essentially seamless phase 1, 2, 3 trials. And in fact, the Pfizer BioNTech trial was a phase 1, 2, 3 trial. They just moved right on through development into their large randomized trial in close to 45,000 people randomized to get the answer that they needed. And while they were doing that, they were putting together a manufacturing process that was very robust and actually starting to make millions of doses of vaccine, so that when they got to the end, if they had something that worked, they would be able to start shipping vaccine, which they did. Now, I wish they would have had more, but at least they had millions of doses to ship, which normally that just is not how it would work. It could have gone wrong, right? If the vaccine wouldn't have worked, they would have had to throw those out. But that would have been a small price to pay, because the benefit of actually having these doses was that they could start on December 12th, 13th, actually it was December 13th, they were able to start vaccinating people with this.
So as an agency, how does the FDA ensure that its safety data is there? You don't have that much physical time to actually monitor the patients.
That's exactly. So this is a really great question. So we have a very good sense that these vaccines were effective because there were so many COVID cases that statistics says we can tell for sure that the vaccine is preventing COVID-19. But we can't compress time. And normally we like 6 months at least of safety data before we would approve a vaccine. So what we're doing instead, first of all, the people in the trials are staying on the trials and we're monitoring them for safety, even if they get vaccinated on the placebo arms. But also we have very large databases which look at claims-based database data that comes in from insurance companies to look for specific issues that might come up with vaccines, so we can monitor millions of lives. We don't get the data, we don't get the person's name itself. We get whether an event has occurred. So it's not like we're invading privacy, but we do, for purposes of public health, have the ability to find out if certain types of events are occurring, and we're looking for those, and we'll have those data, and we get them on a weekly basis now. And we're making sure that nothing comes up that would be of concern. We know with previous vaccines what sometimes can be of concern. So we're looking for all of those things. We're looking for basically about 15 different events that we know can potentially happen with vaccines that would be of concerns. And in addition to that, we also have the old-fashioned adverse event reporting, which is also going on. And every day, our physicians are going through that. And once a week, there's a summary, and we actually post that. So we will continue to monitor vaccine safety very closely because obviously it's something we care about very deeply.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. And people need to understand that the pandemic allowed the vaccine development to occur. Normally, when you have a virus or a pathogen, people aren't being infected left and right, so you don't get events, and that's how you power the study so quickly. And I think that's a really important point to make. But the safety data, right? What people ask is, sure, we have our vaccine data for hepatitis vaccines, been around for a while, but especially the Pfizer and the BioNTech, the mRNA technology is relatively new. So how do we know what questions to even ask? Why do we not know? We don't even know what to ask.
Yeah, well, the good news is that these mRNA vaccines have been around in clinical trials for several years for other infectious diseases. Now, granted, it wasn't with the coronavirus that we're doing now, but there was one in development for Zika, et cetera. So we at least know it's not millions of individuals, but there are at least hundreds of individuals who have been followed for long periods after receiving these, and we haven't seen any adverse effects years down in those individuals. Now, the good news also about mRNA, remember, mRNA is a molecule that's used to transfer information from our genetic code DNA to make protein. It's something it's very fleeting in the body. And there are a lot of enzymes in the body that tend to destroy it very quickly. So this vaccine probably is only present in the body before it's destroyed for a day or two. And at that point, all that's left is the protein that's made. And that's probably not present for all that long either. And that tickles the immune system into making a response that ultimately can be that your body remembers. And when it encounters the virus, it generates the antibodies and the cells that go ahead and kill it. So I think we're at least comfortable that this isn't something. One of the concerns that some people have had is, oh, this is genetic material and it's somehow going to get incorporated in the body. Not this RNA, just not going to happen for two reasons. First of all, it gets degraded in the cell and it can't get into the nucleus of the cell where the DNA is. And even if it could, our bodies don't have the enzyme to allow that RNA to incorporate into the DNA. So that's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think people constantly are talking about this. RNA is new, but as you point out for Zika and other things, I think that's a really important point. So we do know what questions to ask, and we are following for that. So there's nothing hidden out there that we're thinking about for RNA vaccines. The RNA vaccines came out first. J&J, just one shot came out. People are asking, well, what's the difference between the two vaccines? Should I wait for one or the other?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I think part of what's provoked that question has been there are some differences here in terms of the efficacy against moderate to severe COVID-19 between these vaccines. I think at the end of the day, these are essentially a wash right now. And the top line message, I'm going to tell you a little bit more, but my top line message is whatever vaccine you can get, just like Dr. Fauci says, get it. If a vaccine comes along, take it. The 2-dose regimens versus the 1-dose regimen. So the Janssen vaccine has the same kind of excellent efficacy as the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines at preventing people from ending up in the hospital and ending up dying of COVID-19. They all help prevent that in an excellent manner and in a similar manner. It does look like right now, and it wasn't a head-to-head trial, but at least numerically, it looks like the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines are a little ahead of the Janssen vaccine in terms of preventing the moderate cases of COVID-19, the ones that did not end up needing people to go to the hospital. But there were some other advantages that we know about the Janssen vaccine, one of which is it's the only of these vaccines available in the United States that has been available under emergency use in the United States that has been field tested against the South African variant. And it was reasonably effective at preventing people from getting pretty sick with that. And that's a very good thing. It's 1 dose, so it's one and done. And it does tend to have a little bit less in the way of some of the side effects of feeling tired or flu-like after getting the vaccine. That's perhaps because it's just 1 dose. But so I think whichever of these vaccines come along, I think right now it's essentially a wash. Obviously, if something changes with that, we're going to be the first to acknowledge that. We might learn more after there's another trial going on with the Janssen vaccine where instead of studying 1 dose, they're studying 2 doses. And if it turns out that 2 doses of the Janssen vaccine are better than 1 dose, we can always wrap around and vaccinate people with a booster later on. But for right now, I think we have 3 great vaccines. People should use them.
Right. I think you raised a really good point that there's sort of 3 levels. There's getting really severe COVID, there's being infected with COVID and being sick, and then there's asymptomatic carrying. And do we have enough data to know whether or not if you're vaccinated with any of the vaccines, you won't carry the virus or you won't spread it?
So I wish we had the kind of really rock solid data that we like. The data that we'd really like, we're probably not going to have for another couple months because people are just now doing the studies where what they do is they give the vaccine and then they look at nasal swabs to see if people have COVID-19 that they can detect by PCR, even though they're not sick. But we do have a surrogate for that. We have some data from the clinical trials with the Janssen vaccine, where they found that, and we now have data that are coming out of trials for the mRNA vaccines, where it looks like there are fewer people who are asymptomatic carriers. Now, the idea here is if you have fewer asymptomatic cases of COVID-19, it probably means you have fewer people that are able to spread COVID-19. And we expect in the next month or two, through real world evidence, that we'll have additional data that will help us understand that. Some of that data may come from Israel first, because they are going to have a population, they'll probably reach herd immunity as the first country in the world. And so we'll be able to get a sense of that pretty quickly from them.
Yeah. And you mentioned something really important, which was that you said that the vaccine was tested against the South African variants. Do we think, even though the Pfizer and the other mRNA vaccines weren't, that they'll have the same level of protection, or is just based on antibody levels?
So right now we've had some work done in labs where it's felt pretty strongly that the Pfizer, BioNTech, and the Moderna vaccines will likely protect against all the variants that are circulating. We don't have them field tested, but we have good laboratory studies that are pretty robust because they've been done in a large number of replicates, which seem to show that even though they're not the antibody titers, the neutralizing capacity, that is the ability of these vaccines to kill the South African variant, is not the same amount of overkill that it has for the original variant, the original Wuhan strain. there's still going to be plenty of efficacy there. So I don't think we're too worried about these mRNA vaccines right now. We are obviously concerned that something could come up in the future, and that's why we're really monitoring things closely. It's why we're working with the manufacturers to have a game plan, and that's why 2 weeks ago we put out a guidance and about how we were talking with manufacturers about readying just in case we need to change over to address a new strain of COVID-19.
But we still think these vaccines are going to provide important protection. So people, and we're going to get to that in a little bit about, who needs to be vaccinated. People who had COVID, didn't have COVID, but even with these variants going around, we want to still have everyone vaccinated. And I think it would be great to hear, what your thoughts are in terms of the long-term longevity of these vaccines. As we still have millions of people infected, the virus does change. So do we think eventually that the virus will outrun the vaccines that we have? Or you said you have a plan, you sort of answered that already.
Yeah, well, we don't know. I mean, let's say what we do know and we don't know. We don't even know how long these vaccines will protect for right now. We know that it's probably at least 6+ months because we know there are people in the trials who have had the vaccine who continue to maintain immunity. We're hoping that it'll be at least a year. And we're also hoping that if enough people get vaccinated, this may be one of the infectious diseases that we could possibly eradicate, but that might take a couple years, right? It's probably not going to happen in year one, which means it may be that a year from now, we might have to all get boosters. Those of us who are vaccinated might have to get a booster, just like we get a new strain of flu vaccine. That booster might be different from this strain. It might be the same or it might be different. We don't know that yet because we don't know whether the virus will evolve far enough that we'll need that. But we're going to obviously watch that closely. The ultimate hope is that if, in about the next, it probably, as I say, it probably won't happen in 1 year, but the idea would be within a few years, if we can actually get enough people globally vaccinated, we can do to COVID-19 what we did for smallpox, what we're close to doing for polio, and a few other infectious diseases. Now, you might say, well, why do you think you can do that when you can't do that for influenza? And the reason why we can do that for COVID and why we can't do it for influenza is because for influenza, believe it or not, our vaccines are actually not that good. They only get 50% of all flu on a good year, and less on some. Whereas here, we have vaccines that when you have a vaccine that can be 95+% effective, then you can get to this idea that you can come to possibly come to eradication. Whether that's achievable, I don't know, but it might be something that we all want to work towards globally, because I think we don't want to have variants after variants disrupting us in pandemics over the next years.
Yeah. But that's what you just lit up, was a light at the potential light at the end of the tunnel. I think because what happens is, in this community, I think it's almost kind of a double relationship with COVID, where everybody in this community knows some family member or friend that was devastated, passed away, ventilators. We've all seen it. We've all felt it. But we also see that the vast majority of people who have COVID recover almost with little incident sometimes. And so people say, and we got back to the beginning of the talk, the vaccines. Why should I get vaccinated, right? I'm going to be healthy. I'm only affects 1% of people in my age group will get sick. So let me ask you the other question: who should not get vaccinated?
I think probably it's very. I think there are very few people who probably shouldn't get vaccinated. If you've just had COVID-19, you probably don't need to get vaccinated right away. You should talk with your doctor about when the right time to get vaccinated is. If you have just received, like within the past 2 weeks, another vaccine, you probably want to wait at least 2 weeks since another vaccine, because we don't know yet how various vaccines interact with each other. So, just probably better to just wait that time. If you're pregnant, you want to talk with your healthcare provider about the benefits and risks. I can tell you right now, many pregnant women are getting vaccinated. Some OBGYNs feel more comfortable doing it in the second trimester rather than the first trimester, but that's something for you to talk about with your your healthcare provider. If you have an immune deficiency syndrome, these are not live virus vaccines. The biggest issue there is have a conversation with your healthcare provider. They'll probably tell you that we know that they're safe in immunocompromised individuals. It's just a question they may not be quite as effective. So the bottom line is with these vaccines, which are not live virus vaccines, they are very safe to give to different populations. The biggest issue is whether they'll be effective. Pregnant women probably is the population that needs to have a conversation. But as I say, many pregnant women are getting vaccinated, and there is a registry that we'll be able to follow so that in the coming months, we'll probably have a pretty good sense of how safe these are in pregnant women. And we keep following those women so that if any safety signal comes up, we're obviously going to make people aware.
Yeah, and I think the pregnancy one's a really good point because those patients tend to be at a higher risk often, and we see a lot of them hospitalized now. So a really important conversation for people to have now is a good time. So, touch back on it before, the duration of immunity. A lot of people in this community had COVID early on in the first wave. And, we did, and thanks to Chaim and Morty and everyone on this call, we did huge convalescent plasma drives and people with extremely high titers, which are now waning. People have gone from 2880, which was the cyanide Florian Kramer assay, down to undetectable. So what is the normal immunity that you think now? I know we don't know this data, but how long should immunity last after different cases of COVID?
Yeah, there are data that have been published that say that it looks like it lasts for about 6 months. Maybe it lasts more. But I think the right answer here is if you've had COVID a while ago, it's probably not a bad idea to get vaccinated. Why? Because we do know that getting vaccinated against these strains gives sufficient immunity to prevent you from some of these other variants that are circulating around. And so I personally, if I for a family member that I have that has COVID, I would say the rationale for getting vaccinated is to help make sure that with these new variants that are coming across the country, and I don't know which one's going to prevail. I don't know whether it's going to be it's the battle of the UK versus South Africa versus California versus Brazil right now, and I don't know which one is going to predominate. But we know that by having those high antibody titers, it seems to help make sure that you're not going to get reinfected. And we have seen this issue of people. It's not very frequent, but people do seem to be able to get reinfected by a different variant. So I think it probably makes sense. Whether you need 1 or 2 shots after you've had COVID in the past, that's a discussion to have with your doctor. We don't know the answer to that one for sure. There are studies going on. And I think in the absence of having the results from those studies, it's a discussion for you to have with your doctor, whether you get 1 or you get 2 of the Moderna or the Pfizer. Some doctors are suggesting that the easiest thing to do if you've had COVID before is to just get the J&J vaccine because it's one and done in that case.
Well, that's actually good practical advice. I think a lot of people are asking that. A lot of information, as you said, flowing out there. And again, like we said, COVID's an enigma. We don't have always all the answers, but we are seeing that people are saying, should I get 1 or 2 doses? The J&J is a great way to answer that question for now. But I think people's fear is that we get these little cards when you get vaccinated, and people's being recorded. Are those going to be used as travel visas? Are we going to be required to have 2 shots? And I think that's again a question that a lot of questions we got asked.
Yeah, I think the goal here, the goal here is that we're trying to be. I think the government in general is trying to be very sensitive about this issue, and it's one of the reasons why there's been a tremendous care taken about not having, for instance, the information about who's been vaccinated given widely to insurance companies, et cetera. So I hope that we don't get up into any situation where we make anyone feel uncomfortable about this, because the reason for people to get vaccinated is not because it's mandatory. It's because they know it's going to help themselves and their communities. And so I hope we don't get to that place. I'm not the one that ultimately makes decisions about that, but from my perspective, it's not something that should be a mandatory thing. It's something that we should be doing because we feel comfortable about helping our communities here, and we feel comfortable with this. Listen, it's normal for people to feel a little nervous about getting an injection. If you show me somebody that likes having needles stuck in their arm, they probably need to see someone professional to get some help with that. Okay, so it's normal to ask questions about this, but these are very safe vaccines. We've been regulating vaccines at the Center for Biologics since before the FDA existed. We've been doing this since 1903. The first vaccine that was regulated through our what became our center was smallpox vaccine. It was a pretty good vaccine. We don't need to use it very much anymore, except in military personnel, because it doesn't exist except as a bioweapon. We take our job very seriously. Our inspectors take their jobs very seriously, and there are enough people involved that I can absolutely assure you that there aren't any. These are pure vaccines. There's no funny stuff getting put into those vaccines, because that's just not something that any of us would ever tolerate.
Yeah, so I think, people are concerned, and listen, you're making great points. I think people question, on the other way, if I get 2 vaccines, my antibody titers are high. Is there any danger that we've seen for people who have too many antibodies?
So far, there's no evidence that you can have antibody titers that are too high. And we can tell you that, just to come back to convalescent plasma. Two things on convalescent. First, let me answer the question on convalescent plasma. We know people had incredibly high antibody titers. We know that because of how generous so much of your community was in donating convalescent plasma. And there were people in the community who donated who had antibody titers that were off the charts. I mean, they were, they had, how high off the charts were they? They were essentially 3 orders of magnitude higher. So that's basically 3 powers of 10 higher than people who the average person who had COVID-19. So that's pretty amazing. So we know that there's a pretty large span of antibodies that one can have and still be okay. So I think we're not too concerned about that. And I do have to say, I just want to make sure I don't end the evening not thanking, I have to thank Chaim for an incredible effort and the community for an incredible effort with getting out and donating convalescent plasma, because especially early on in the pandemic, but also through the summer, it made an incredible difference. And it continues to make a difference as a therapy that has saved lives. And that's a great example of how, when all the dust settles, there was a lot of noise and stuff about that. When all the dust has settled, we clearly see, and that data actually is going to be coming out in publications very shortly. We clearly see a very clear survival advantage that was given to quite a number of people from being able to be treated with convalescent plasma. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, I'd love to come back and revisit that at another time. I know running late, so I want to get to the last couple of questions. I also want to say that if anyone's worried about having too many high titer antibodies, they can donate their plasma to New York Blood Center or to Mount Sinai Hyperimmune Globulin Program, which is still collecting donors. So just some specific questions that people had there was some question early on whether or not these mRNA vaccines affected fertility. Anything to say to that?
Yeah, we've investigated pretty closely. There is no evidence. And in fact, they were studied. First of all, that was a rumor that was spread by someone who was anti-vaccination. There's no evidence of what the person claimed. The other thing is we've studied these in animals pretty carefully. They're called development and reproductive toxicology studies, and there was no evidence of any adverse effect.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that people say is that, we have all these people getting vaccinated, and things happen in real life. People get Bell's palsy. People have strokes. So people associate things, but any signal that you can share with us of any other adverse events post the EUA data?
Yeah, the major ones that we're following that we don't know whether they matter or whether they are materially higher in people with vaccinated or not. We're following Bell's palsy because we weren't sure there's a little imbalance, but we don't know that there's a higher incidence. We're following vascular events. Again, we don't know. The one signal that we did see that we have to address was these severe allergic reactions, which we saw very early on. And that's why we ask people now if they've had any allergies to vaccination, particularly, and why we watch people for about 15 minutes after they get vaccinated. It turns out that the risk of these, based on the large monitoring that we've done, the risk of an allergic reaction is about 1 in 250,000. None of them have been fatal. They've generally, now we know to have epinephrine, basically the management available for these, they've been taken care of. So that was the one safety signal that came out very early on, and we continue to watch for anything that might come up.
So, Dr. Marks, we're going to end in 2 minutes, unless anyone else is going to send a question. But I think you really, again, light at the end of the tunnel. Potentially, COVID does not have to become a seasonal pandemic for us. Seasonal, not pandemic, a seasonal pathogen for us, and that's the responsibility of everyone. What do you say to people who are in their 20s or 30s? Just say, I'm not going to get sick. I don't want to get vaccinated. Maybe you can explain.
Yeah. So what I would probably say is, look, we have a responsibility to one another, and we have to care about each other enough. Even though you might not get sick, if you're not vaccinated, you can it's very likely. I'm using a little bit of knowledge that I don't have every I dotted and T crossed for, but I'm pretty sure about this, that probably if you're not vaccinated, you're going to be somebody that can potentially spread COVID-19 around. And we all need to take our part in preventing this from spreading. Because I don't think any of us wants to know. I mean, I think it's very easy if you don't think about it for a bit. But if you think about it, if you transmit COVID-19 to 2 or 3 other people, and it just so happens that one of those other people is an 80-year-old who has a 20-fold higher risk of dying from COVID-19 than a younger person, and they die, you'd feel horrible, right? So I think the reason to get vaccinated if you're a young, healthy individual is, look, this is part of what we do to help our communities. It's part of what we do to make sure that we are doing our part. People, I think, that you can feel good then that you're doing what you need to help others in protecting our communities.
That's very, very helpful. And I think, again, looking that if we all get vaccinated, we could potentially end this whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I think, Dr. Bander, that's to me the big thing here is I would like us it would really be nice not to have another thing to have to chase our tail with year after year again. And so I agree, if the more of us that get vaccinated, the whole point of here is if you have enough people vaccinated, the reason why smallpox doesn't exist anymore, it's not that every last person was vaccinated. It's that enough people were vaccinated that the virus had nowhere to go but out. And that's what we need to do here, is give the virus no place to go but out.
So last topic, for once we're vaccinated or people are vaccinated, can you take off your mask, and when can you do that?
Yeah, so this is a really great question. And I think this week you might see some guidance coming from CDC. It's probably going to be that if you're vaccinated and you're with other people who have been vaccinated in your home, you can actually, if you're fully vaccinated, you can take off your masks at home. They're probably also may say something about even if you've been fully vaccinated and in your home environment and you have people who haven't been vaccinated, it may even be reasonable to have, if it's just one other family, to be able to not wear your mask. So stay tuned for that guidance coming from CDC this week. But I think the idea here is to start to help people feel that if they've been vaccinated, they can kind of free up from some of the restrictions.
Okay. Well, that's also good. The other light in the tunnel, returning to normalcy, schools and all that. So the
Exactly.
vaccines are leading the way for us to be able to demask and regroup with our people and have a normal holiday season coming up, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's been, look, the disruption for all of us has been terrible. Children, older people have suffered the most from isolation, but everyone has suffered from, we're social beings, and this has been a terrible, terrible time for everything from, it was just a friend of mine was just bemoaning the fact that they attended a virtual bar mitzvah yesterday, and it was really kind of, they were crying because it was kind of sad to actually, this normally joyous occasion that you get to share in the flesh, you have to do at a distance right now, and it's just, that's a happy event at a distance, let alone some of the others. So it'll be wonderful when we can be able to have weddings, bar mitzvahs, and everything back in the flesh, and we can get there with vaccination.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to end here, except that Chaim's making me ask you a question, which is very important to him and all of us, is monoclonal antibodies. Will there be any change in the EUA giving it for younger people, as we're getting a lot of as the strains become potentially or more transmissible here, or maybe even more virulent? Will monoclonal antibodies be available for younger people?
It's so I can tell you they're looking at those emergency use authorizations, and I can't say how it's going to come out, but it might change with time as we move along here.
Okay. Well, I'm going to let you go. I know you have a busy night, and really thank you for joining us and appreciate the time. Finally got to meet you.
No, I really appreciate everyone's, I think I appreciate all of your efforts, and I really appreciate everything that Chaim has done he has been a public health mensch, and we're very grateful for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night.